Now, in the 2013 campaign, the number of markets that were included were only markets who had previously been approved in the Employee Express pilot. Whether we can expand that is still under consideration for 2014. So there's about 2.5 million military and civilians that work at the Department of Defense. That's about 20 to 25% of the federal workforce. So prior to this system, they could not make a payroll deduction pledge electronically. They could use a credit card in some markets, but they couldn't use any other electronics. The benefits that we saw on this as we started moving forward was it increases donor confidentiality because there is no pledge card floating from person to person. It reduces the administrative backload both on the front end of the campaign where you don't have to print and distribute pledge cards, in the middle of the campaign where you have to collect reports and deposits, or at the end when you have to enter that data. It also greatly minimizes the number of administrative errors that are injected because somebody has to rekey information into a system after the donors made a choice. And then finally, it does reduce the costs because you can avoid certain costs and eliminate others. Now, the platform is intended for use until OPM introduces the new systems that would be implied in any potential rules that may get published in the future. And it works in conjunction with 3 different legacy payroll systems. And by legacy, I mean these are systems that were probably built when people were punching key cards. And there's some of you who may not even know what those are. But there is a defense civilian payroll system. There is a joint military payroll system that handles the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. And then there's the Marine Corps total force system because they're Marines and they have their own system. And so the data from MyPay has got to flow back into all 3 of those systems. So, you know, it's not just, and then it's got to also flow back out into your administrative systems at the PCFO level. Now, as the federal government has been consolidating the payroll offices, the different payroll providers don't just have clients in their home agency. So just like the National Finance and the National Business Center are not limited to agriculture and interior, DFAS is also not limited to the military and civilians in the Department of Defense. Their services are also provided to VA, the Executive Office of the President, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of the Energy, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and possibly others. So the customer base for these finance and accounting services goes beyond just the military. So we rolled it out last year from September 1st through January 11th of this year. You know, even though the campaigns were shut down, this system stayed in operation through that suspension. And we were able to extend it for most of the campaign extension period up until January 11th. And how did we do? In the first year, there were more than 42,000 donors in the MyPay system who made their payroll deduction pledge using this. Now, I was able to track between reports from the CFC Overseas and from Nexus about 25 top markets and how giving was going in those 25 regions. And in just the 25, not the full 89 markets, there was almost 15 million in pledges from just those regions. A $583 average gift in those markets compared to a $300 average gift in the 2012 final data. So about 17% of pledges, 17% of dollars, and 11% of the pledges. This is just a chart by month, so you can see the pledge volume obviously peaked in November, October, November, and December. And this is how those pledges spread out over those 3 legacy payroll systems. So the blue on this are the civilians that made a pledge through MyPay, about 54%. The red are the Army, Navy, Air Force, 43%, and the 3% is the Marine Corps. When we extrapolate those numbers, if we look at the overall 42 million, without a common reporting database to me from all campaigns, we're estimating 25 million in pledges were made through MyPay in the first year. If we go back to the testimony that was put out during the CFC 50 commission, there was an estimate that it was costing $14 to process a piece of paper that was a pledge. Everything from printing, distribution, deposits, reporting, and everything else. If we were to save the savings for the pledges made through MyPay could be over $600,000 in the first year. And the average gift was more than $200. So, $200 more than it was in other systems. Now, it wasn't easy to get to January 11th. Those of you in the room who helped implement it for the first year know we didn't actually have approval for this system until the end of August. So the training hurdle to get this system started was pretty immense in the first year. And we've certainly learned a few lessons. There's some inherent limitations because this has to interact with those payroll systems. So when a donor makes a pledge in MyPay, they can't change it. So the research that they do on your site to decide which charities I'm going to designate to and how much is important. So MyPay is a transactional site. It is not a website for the DoD CFC. So your home campaign websites play a vital role in making sure the donor comes into this system prepared to make their transaction. If they do have to change it after they've made it, they would do the same thing they would do if they wanted to change a paper pledge that they'd submitted. They'd contact the PCFO and the payroll office because as your forms are separated, they need to make those changes. The second issue we had this year is that the work address field where they would identify if they are, what their military command and unit is or their federal agency and office is an alphanumeric field. That means they have to type it in. So one of the big differences in Employee Express, for those of you who have used it, is you can populate that Employee Express work address field with a database so they're picking off a drop-down list. So that was probably the area where we had some of the most errors, and I know that John will address some of the ways we had to cope with that. We also had donors, so in those legacy military environments, if you're a Defense Department or DFAS customer and you're a civilian, MyPay automatically recognized what your home campaign was based on your login. If you're a Marine, it also recognized your home campaign. But if you were a soldier, sailor, or airman, you had to type in the 4-digit PCFO code. And that resulted in some people making a pledge that might have been outside their home geographic campaign. Oh my God. Charlie called me early in the campaign. He's like, I got some guy who pledged to me here in San Diego from St. Louis, I think it was. And we had a few of those issues. And as we got to the end, we worked with OPM to give guidance that if the federal employee picked a campaign outside their geographic area, I want to point out to you, 5 CFR 950.103H. Okay? That's the section of the CFC code that allows those pledges to stay in the campaign where the donor originated it. It doesn't mean that anybody in the room was campaigning outside their borders, but the federal employee made a pledge to a certain charity through a certain campaign, and we left those intact. And then finally, we had some people who made fairly substantial pledges. So we also advised at the end of the campaign to do some verification. If you had a donor in MyPay who made a pledge of more than $2,500, you know, $100 a pay period or roughly for a civilian, you know, go back and have somebody in the federal, chain of command, a loan executive, a key worker, campaign manager, just verify, hey, this is our first year. Want to make sure that those big pledges are actually are taking place. So there were certain limitations on that in the DJMS system, the Joint Military System for the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They could not pledge more than $9,999 for a year. So they couldn't pledge over a certain amount based on the limitations of the field. So what I would refer to as the Y2K problem of DJMS. You know, they couldn't pledge $10,000. If they wanted to pledge more than $10,000, they could fill out a paper pledge card and still do that. So we did have issues that we wanted to make sure people didn't over pledge. Now we are talking about some modifications in this, and again, could we expand this to other markets where DoD and DFAS customers exist that it's not in right now? Could we improve that work address field by using that database kind of drop down that you're used to with Employee Express? What happens with universal giving, and how would that impact these systems? So yes, in the 3 markets that were just up here, Chicago and Heart of Alabama and Olympic Peninsula, they had universal giving and they had MyPay. There's also programming issues to make that available more broadly in those systems. I'd love it for somebody to be able to edit their pledge during open season. And the donor had about a 30-minute time frame to make their transaction. So again, if you can only make that transaction in 30 minutes, let's take a look at a way to improve that from the customer standpoint. And then, for those who were willing to implement this with us, again, we were breathing down the neck of September 1 to get this thing tested and ready to go. But if we want DFAS and Employee Express to make any changes in this system, the only changes I would want them to do are things that they could affect by the spring release. So whatever product is available for this year is stable and you can do your training materials. So if they can't make some of these changes quickly, I'd rather wait and keep the platform stable. Now, and any of those changes, so obviously some of those are dependent on decisions from OPM, and they're also dependent on how Employee Express and DFAS spend their programming dollars, because they do know that this is a platform that has a short, and we're not even sure how to define short, lifespan. So they've got to decide, are programming changes high effort and high cost? And what if any of you are used to using any of the Microsoft programs, there was always a phrase, if you couldn't get it to work, you had to figure out a way to work around it. So we're also, as we talk about some of these changes, trying to figure out, is there a way to make these changes at a low effort and at a low cost and still get some of the end result. So I don't know those answers today, but this conversation is well timed because the DFAS Control Board meets on Tuesday or Wednesday of next week to at least begin considering our requests for modifications in this as we move forward. And again, we want to keep that as a manageable amount, so they're not going to commit to investing in things that are too intensive at this stage of the product life cycle. So that's kind of the broad overview of what we did and how we did it. But I'd like to turn the microphone over to our panelists and turn to Rama. Now, the Department of the Navy in the National Capital Area runs a campaign that, if they were a separate PCFO, would probably be about the 5th largest campaign in the nation. So Rama, would you share some of your experience?
Thank you so much, Tony. I appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. So as far as in the Department of the Navy, let's talk about why e-giving was really important for the Navy and the Marine Corps. We, in the Navy and Marine Corps, made e-giving our top priority when it was time to roll the system out, MyPay. We were able to enable, engage, and connect with the donors, allowing them and giving them an option to give, really, and putting that out there for them. Our goal really was strictly to provide the donors a clear and simple way and giving them instructions so that they didn't run across any issues with rolling out any type of system. We created instructions at our charity fairs and or awareness events. We had stations, e-stations, where we had a computer there, so just in case somebody came to a charity fair or an awareness event, it was there for them. And we had key workers and or campaign managers standing there and waiting just in case they had questions. So when this rolled out, we trained our campaign managers in 2 parts. We trained them initially, and then when the system came out, we held another training to say, you know what, come back, because this is important for you to know how to roll out the system and make it simple and easy for the donors, because it's really all about the donors and how they understood and what was out there. As far as marketing, the Department of the Navy and Marine Corps, and I'm going to say Army, Army came up with this wonderful idea of Mr. MyPay. I don't know if you all had gone online and looked at it, but that was one of the huge marketing things that we, use to roll this out. It was a huge kind of like
It was like Mr. Dollar Bill from
yes.
the CFC video a couple
Yes.
years ago, and people would wear Mr. Dollar Bill to events, and they were Mr. MyPay.
They were Mr. MyPay, and it was all about promoting MyPay and ensuring that people knew that was an option to give. I'm trying to think of some of the other ways that we did at our charity events. We really wanted the donors to grasp and adopt and promote MyPay. So that's kind of how I'd like to end it. I mean, if and again, I'm here for questions if anybody had questions.
So Rama, represents one of the campaign managers at the front end in a very big campaign. John is from CFC NCA, but he works in their back office. And so we wanted the perspective of what do you do with this data? How does it work and integrate with your other systems to also be reflected? So John, you want to...
Sure. I'd like to begin, thank you, Tony. I'd like to begin with a few stats on what NCA looks like, what is large. with the pending snow in D.C., it looks like some campaign managers rushed some envelopes into the system yesterday and pushed us over $51 million in campaign pledges. The number right now is north of 83,000 pledges, and of those, about 16,000 are Nexus payroll pledges, over 8,000 are EEX payroll pledges, and just under 10,000 are MyPay pledges. So 41% of our pledges came from one of those three electronic platforms. That's payroll pledges only. But 55% of our dollars, 55% of 51 million at this point came from online payroll pledges on those three platforms. Now, specifically with MyPay and the reporting unit ID issue, of the 10,000 pledges that were made, we had about a 22% error rate. That means over 2,000 pledges have to be manually corrected. And we have over 2,200 reporting units. So it was a daunting task. The strategy I took was to package each week all pledges from Saturday to Friday, and I named it by the weeks of the campaign. So there are 20 weeks that took us through the 11th of January. And to get a little bit technical, for those of you who are doing the downloads out of EEX, I used the Excel format for several reasons. One is the CSV format throws errors into the data file. Number two, the Excel format allows you to encrypt the file, which we do in order to share that file with those who are doing the correcting. So once I had a week's worth of pledges, say for week 10, I would send that off to our DoD component, and they would correct their entries, and they would send it back to us, and then we would correct the civilian entries. Now, our civilian, the 5 civilian or 6 civilian agencies that use MyPay are pretty big. So when that was done, we had a file that was close, but on a week-by-week basis, that was closer to perfection. We would batch
John, which field were you correcting?
the work address field.
The work address field, that alphanumeric field. People just don't know where they work.
And for an IT guy, I twitched every time I was editing a work address field with a 7-digit numeric value. Yeah. There is the importer in Nexus is built to allow you to repetitively batch in files. So you can take a week's worth of pledges, load them in, and it'll kick out errors. You can correct that file and load it again, and it'll pick up the corrections. You can correct it again and load it again, and it'll continue to mine that file for correct pledges until you have just a small set of errors that you can go after. So I would repeatedly, with each edit process, take the same file and run it into the importer. That was sort of phase one. Once we got past the campaign and it ended on the 11th, I did one download in EEX for the entire campaign, and that was my master audit. It had the total number of pledges. In the case of MyPay, 9,932, and a dollar amount that I summed on column Y. So that's the pledge amount and a number and the dollar number that I was shooting for in Nexus on the reporting side. That master file is what I work against when I'm trying to get all of the 20 weeks worth of files corrected, and those get concatenated into a file that I batch in. When that file is all correct, in Nexus, I'm going to delete the MyPay batch and reload the corrected master batch to get everything straightened out. That will give me the correct number of pledges, the correct dollar amounts, and all the correct charity designations. So there's kind of a before and after phase. As far as the campaign is going on, the weekly file is what I correct, but at the beginning of the campaign, I was loading in the file after Friday. As things started to warm up, I went to Tuesday, Thursday. As the pot started to boil, I went to every day. And when things were really cooking and we were hitting $1 million days, I was doing it several times a day. Remember, there's no negative consequence in going into EEX, grabbing a day's worth of pledges and running them into Nexus. It moves the numbers, and we have lots of people in NCA who are watching that screen minute by minute, seeing what's going on in their campaigns. That's all I have.
Okay. And also on our panel is Susie Himmelhock. So Susie is in Miami Valley. No, not where LeBron moved to, his home state. And she has the VA and the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So this was something. Now, several of you may have been involved in testing this system. We certainly recruited about half a dozen or so PCFOs before this rolled out to test it. Nita tested it in Honolulu, and Victoria tested it with CFC Overseas and a few others. Susie didn't have any clue this was coming down the pike until probably, I don't know, September 3rd. And then we dropped it in her lap. So, Susie?
Good morning. It really is best when I'm clueless. Otherwise, I start getting worried and concerned. Just to give you an oversight a little bit about our success with MyPay this year. And our campaign was down significantly. We're not proud of that. However, 70% of the dollars pledged to our campaign this year were through MyPay. Total e-pledge giving to our campaign this year was 87% of the total. We're really very proud of that. We have been using e-pledge since 2011, and I am very fortunate that primarily our key workers and campaign chairs, agency chairs at Wright-Patterson, we had to, any pledge made through CFC Nexus had to be downloaded and wet signed and authenticated, and socials had to be on it, and then it had to be put in a paper envelope and sent to the payroll processor or timekeeper. When I told at our trainings our volunteers that there was the very good chance that that would be eliminated, they were thrilled. They just, how can we do this? So when MyPay was approved, thank you, Tony, for all you did. Thank you, OPM, and a special thanks to CFC Nexus for making it all work. Like John said, we watch those statistics by the second practically. We sent out an email to our volunteers and said, within DOD and the VA, and said, MyPay is live. You can pledge through MyPay. This is what the donor will have to do. We highly recommend that they have their charity codes selected before going into MyPay, and the rest is history. Yes, like Tony said, people do not know where they work. That really wasn't that big of a problem for me. I'm very fortunate to be embedded at Wright-Patterson, so all I had to do was go to the Global and find out where they worked.
The Global is the Defense Department's global address list. So you can look up just about anybody and find out their home office or their military command. When we saw large contributions come in, because I downloaded this every morning, we had our loaned executives contact those donors to see if it was a valid pledge or if they had made a mistake. We also work closely with the payroll processors or timekeepers or CSRs. They've got all different names at Wright-Patterson and at the VA to rectify any. I think there were 3 or 4 mistakes that were made to rectify those. So we will not be going back to paper. I mean, we do offer paper, but we will not be backing away from MyPay at all. Hope that we can expand the importance of it. I would be remiss if I didn't say that Wright-Patterson is a highly technologically advanced group of people. As I say, if you don't have 3 monitors on your desk, you are way behind time. So that did help with the process for us, that nobody was afraid of it. They all
whether that we have several branches of service at Wright-Patt, so it is primarily Air Force, but there is also Navy and Air Force, Navy, Army, and Marines. But none of them are afraid of this, and all of them manage their benefits through MyPay online now. So it was a built-in success.
Okay.
Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Susie. So now there are these microphones out in the room. If I know Bruce and his panel had to handle all the really hot questions this morning, and the rest of them are going to be held up for Keith later. But yes, ma'am.
This may be a dumb question, but there's no such thing, right?
No.
So we just merged with the Gold Coast campaign, which is a very heavy Navy campaign. And when we had our last merger meeting with their LFCC, was the first time I'd ever heard of MyPay. And our PCFO said, "Oh, did you use MyPay?" And the captain said, "No, we were told, that it was like more labor intensive." And so, why was there resistance at some places throughout the country, or
Well,
was there?
Again, oh sure. Keep in mind this system. We were testing it in August. And I probably dropped a memo in Keith's email about August 20th saying the testing had worked successfully, but the adoption period for training was very short. So there was admittedly some resistance in this first year because people had their materials, their training materials were already done. Even the folks who were helping test it didn't know that we might roll it out, until it got finally approved. So there was some first-year jitters, and some people did elect not to proceed in the first year. But I think we now have the experience of a year to see that the platform works. Now, there's a lot more slides in the presentation that you have with you. So even if nothing is changed by DFAS, EEX, or OPM, you have in your possession the training slides for last year. So the learning curve should be fairly short, and you can be much better prepared come May, June, and July to roll this out in places that were reluctant to do it this year. Oh, yes, Bruce.
I think a comment and a request, actually. A comment is good job on implementing this on short notice. And the request would be, I think the one change that most of us would really like to see, as you know, for the upcoming campaign would be the drop-down list of accounts. And I understand what the constraints are there that may not happen. But as soon as you know whether it will or it won't, if you could let us know right away, and that would really help us as we prepare for marketing and outreach and training for the coming campaign. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hey, Tony, good morning. It's Rick Roble from San Antonio.
Oh, hi, Rick.
Susan, I'm also a proud graduate of Miami University. Go Redskins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, first of all, last year when we rolled out the MyPay, I was another one, obviously, was surprised with the late rollout. And I made a deliberate decision not to roll it out for the San Antonio campaign outside of a test architecture. With our testing, fantastic results that we had. A huge population that wants it, that used it. Obviously for us as well, the biggest number one issue we had was with that name field. And I'm cautiously optimistic that that one, if any change, if that one change can be made, I'm a full convert, okay? Two success stories that we contribute in San Antonio to MyPay. One of them was with the Navy. You'll be surprised to know that San Antonio does have a fairly significant naval presence. And for geography here, San Antonio is not bounded by any bodies of water.
Is that the Houston ship channel's been dug all the way to San Antonio?
Yeah. And of our two legs, they're pretty low. But of our naval population, unfortunately, are kind of treated like redheaded stepchildren. There is no love for the Navy personnel because it's significantly smaller than the Air Force and the Army things. So they don't really get the love at the finance centers for processing their paper pledge forms, and particularly the Navy civilians. Very, very difficult to find out who their particular pay office is to get the process. And I had one organization that had 12 civilian Navy paper pledge forms, and she could not, for the life of her, get anybody, and I mean anybody, to accept those pledge forms. She came and talked to me and said, you know what, let's go ahead and work these guys on my pay if they're all here. She went to each and every one of those people and basically just had them replicate their pledge on my pay. Every single one went through. So that was the only way those pledges were going to get through. So that was a great thing for my pay. The other thing that my pay did for us, and since the civilian DFAST system automatically associates them with their local area, we were able to discover 7 new organizations in San Antonio that never, ever participated in the San Antonio campaign. These were organizations that were either operating locations or detachments of other organizations, and they range from a 2-person shop to a 250-person maintenance squadron. And again, they've always given through their parent organization elsewhere. So with the MyPay, it kind of forced the issue that I was able to talk with the commander or the director of the organization and explain why they're kind of being forced to give to local San Antonio. But as such, we then were able to get it was almost 450 new potential donors by rolling these organizations in. So those are great success stories for MyPay. And again, optimistically cautious, but hopefully if we can get those the software changes done for 2014, we can roll it out to all 66,000 people in San Antonio. It would be great.
Yeah, and
Great
what
success.
on that, our office, the VCMO, is working on some compromises with the EEX staff. I think they don't necessarily have the personnel to reach out to every one of you and get those. So if they agree to do it, you'll probably be hearing from, myself or Mike Kelly or Stephanie Petway in our office to get those databases from you so we can provide it in a package so that EEX just has to fold them into the system if they agree to do it.
Mine's available today.
Good, okay. So again, early is better for all of these things. So, again, we want this locked down by Memorial Day so you know what to do for training. Barbara?
Feedback. And I'm a proponent of this. So, but I just want to share with you some of the stuff that we got from donors and commanders and such. So the donors loved it, okay? And the commanders, because we've created a culture for, well, I can't say we created, but we play into the typical military culture for competition. The commanders really wanted those unit reports, and we weren't able to provide those. Specific, as an example, we have the Air Force Academy, and they are trying to build officers who become lifetime donors. And so we have 40 squadrons of just cadets alone, and we could not give them reporting of each of those squadrons, and we could not really have a good, strong way of breaking out the different Air Force bases, okay, because we have 3 Air Force bases. We also have a joint command, so we have Navy, Coast Guard, all of that in one of our joint commands, and then we have Army. So we do not have access to global, and if that's something that you can help us establish in the local field to get global access, I
You'd
can
have
get
to
a
use the federal employees, so either the coordinators, loaned executives, or campaign managers.
Okay.
So I can't, if you're a PCFO, I can't get you access to the global.
Okay.
But
so-
again, that does tie to regulation because the PCFOs should not be contacting donors about their pledges. So we do have to, by regulation,
Right.
go back through those channels.
Right. So because of that and not having access, the work didn't go to the payroll offices. It went to the installation project officers and their key workers to try and do manual sorts, and he addressed the percentages. Ours was a little bit higher. We had a little bit shorter training mechanism time. Not a problem because we can fix that in the future. The other thing is somehow the Air Force was aware of this program before anybody else, so
They were.
they put out internal memorandum that they would not accept paper pledges, and they put in memorandum that this was the only way that the contributions could be done. So you can imagine the panic that set in. Not that's easily overcome, but my feedback would be is if they're in a test or if they're being made aware of this, if you could somehow let the rest of us be aware of that so we can address those concerns and
Yeah,
those
so
answers.
as we were going through, we had a test period in May and another one in August. And so in addition to the VCMO office and about a half a dozen PCFOs doing those tests, DFAS got DJMS, McTIFs, and DCPS also testing. So if I were to guess, the DJMS people told the Air Force that this test was happening. So, but again, you're right. Sometimes these things have a tendency to seep out.
And then the last thing that I would say is if we as a PCFO or CFC community could come up with some type of coding that the DoD uses that we could train on that is universal, so that if they're at Peterson Air Force Base and then they transfer to Maxwell or to Wright-Patterson, we're all using the same coding. Because to solve the problem, with that short timeline, we use the Nexus code identifiers. But I think that probably Susie used something different, and San Antonio might have chosen something different. So if we could somehow make those all universal, I think that will help as we recognize that personnel transfer, particularly
Yeah.
officers, every 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, and I think that would help long-term, that
Right.
we would share some sort of joint database. So, we know that it starts with the Army, the Navy, Marine Corps, the Air Force, and the civilians. And there's a tree structure in DOD, and it's just a matter of how deep we go, because some of you may go 7 or 8 layers deep, and how far do we take that, I think but, it's certainly a good point.
So if we can get on telecons or something like
Right.
that to discuss it, that would be awesome. Thank
Okay.
you.
Larry?
Good morning. This is not an endorsement of any product. Congratulations, kudos for getting 2 out of the 5 payroll centers on board with online giving. However, it seems like the majority of folks are going back into CFC Nexus. And as one of my counterparts said, this is an example of dumb government. We have 5 different payroll centers trying to build 5 different platforms when we could contract out to an outside entity that knows what we're doing, that can really kind of solve all these questions and problems, identifiers and everything, and we just need to, get them into the back room access as well. But, Keith, if you can kind of help that, that would solve so many problems for the PCFOs and for, again, not an endorsement for one company over another, but, there is something, the expertise that they have. Just what government's doing is going to the experts, so if we could kind of look into that.
Can I ask for clarification? You're saying that someone should be able to interact with the payroll departments in the payroll process within the federal government?
Well, right now, as a donor, right now we're training on 3 different payroll systems. Okay, sounds like DC has half of your donations going through Nexus right now, correct?
Correct.
Okay, online pledges. However, those online pledges do not go directly to the payroll offices, correct? You have to send those to the payroll offices, or?
We have 123 agencies. We have to find 123 payroll specialists or more. We have to figure out every
Exactly.
front-end system that's got to be interfaced with. There is not, in 123 visits, there isn't one consistent way that any agency processes payroll.
I understand.
So it's extremely heterogeneous. So I'm just wondering where we solve that problem, at what point?
Well, currently Employee Express, Social Security, when someone pledges through there, it goes directly to the payroll office.
Right.
Okay. My understanding, Nexus, if allowed the backroom opportunity, they could send that to the payroll office as well. Yeah, there would have to be some work being.
If the payroll office accepted that file
If the
from
payroll
Nexus,
office- right.
so there are having these, whether it's EEX or MyPay, having things that are integrated does help avoid. So in essence, the pledges that John gets for NCA or any of you through MyPay or EEX do not have to be processed to those 123 or whatever your subset of agencies are.
Your clarification was good. In the case of HHS, they are a MyPay DFAS organization, but their system of record is their ERP system. So the Nexus data goes into their ERP. They vet it there and match Social Security numbers before they send a file to DFAS. So Nexus will never be able to talk to DFAS. In the case of HHS, they have to talk to the ERP system. So it's quite mind-boggling. But anything we can do to simplify it, I think, is positive.
But they are talking, though, right? Eventually, it's happening.
Nexus created a data download
Right.
that allows HHS to expedite the processing of payroll pledge data for delivery to DFAS.
So
That
it's
is
those
correct.
baby steps. But
Right.
again, it seems like we're reinventing the wheel every year.
Well, and even with HHS, they're not necessarily committed to staying with DFAS as their accounting service for payroll information. They could switch to the Business Center, the National Finance Center. So that's their decision as the Department of Health and Human Services. So, they've been somewhat reluctant to implement this because over the last 3 years, they've had 3 different systems, electronic giving for CFC, that they've had to train to.
So again, if you had one contractor that was running it, you could just change that coding as far as where that goes into.
And consideration also has to be given to the fact that if it were a contractor, that it be on a government server and not on a server outside of the government system, which is my understanding from what we've experienced at Wright-Patterson.
Larry, you make a valid point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I wanted to ask Rama about the marketing materials that were used when you were promoting it. It sounded like there was maybe a cloak that said MyPay on it or something. Are there photos on a website someplace or something we can go look at to replicate?
Absolutely. If you go to the CFCNCA website, go to cfcnca.org. There are plenty and tons of photos. And even if you go, I can also send you some of the photos that we took over at the Department of Navy, what we used as well. I plan to give Tony some of the information that we use as far as marketing. I'll email it to him, and also the instructions. Maybe he can post the instructions on how we in the Department of Navy and Marine Corps did as far as the marketing aspect of it, so you all can have it.
That'd be great. And I just also want to underscore what Bruce said. I think that having the drop-down menu is a big important thing for us. And also, Tony, you were talking about how many layers down we go. In order to actually run a successful campaign, you need a lot of granularity so you can actually tell the units how they're doing. So the more we get, the happier we are.
Mm-hmm. And if you're searching for that picture, during the 2-week government shutdown in CFC-NCA, Mr. MyPay was our key worker of the week. So if you search for Mr. MyPay at cfcnca.org, he had great results.
He did.
Beverly?
Okay, so how do I book Mr. MyPay for my kickoffs this fall?
Well, actually, you can get the graphic file from the Department of the
I want
Army.
him to come
and-
in the suit. I want him to be there, with laptops and stuff. A couple of questions. The drop down, I'm a little concerned about. Our campaign does very unique codes that we assign to our organizations. So unless you're going to be willing, or they're going to be willing to take our data and input it into MyPay, I don't see how the drop-down menu is going to work unless we reconfigure our organizations to match what's already in the system.
I mean, the only way would be to make it work. So, for example, if we know in advance what it'll be, you can train to that. So if we're
you give it the information to us,
No,
not
well,
us giving the information to
two
you.
things. If we get approval to put that in there, we would reach out to campaigns to get that.
Okay.
We may not be able to do it for 90 campaigns, but the top 25 campaigns probably have the bulk of the data sorting issues. So that may be one compromise we do, is to try to limit the number so EEX doesn't think that this is a huge hurdle. And then, so if in Heart of Alabama you use words, the 30-second air wing, but in CFC-NCA they use an 8-digit code, give me your list, and then you can
great.
train to it. If it stays an alphanumeric field, you'll know that by Memorial Day, and you'll be able to train to it. So
Okay.
in the Pentagon, you could walk through the D-ring, and you could be going through the OSD offices, and on their posters and on their catalogs, they wrote, this is what you put in that
Their
field.
organization code. The other thing, we did have a few, I don't even want to say a handful, a few donors that came in from outside of our area. And although the reg says that we could keep that funds, what we did out of goodwill is just contact that campaign director and say, we've got funds. Would you like us to send it to you or redirect this donor to you somehow? And it was, no, it's good kind of deal. But just out of goodwill to communicate to them that we had funds coming in that,
And
that
you,
were not
you should be
our-
able to give a report. Certainly, we would encourage you to give that report so for those award ceremonies, people could recognize the
And
full
then my
level.
last question was, you mentioned that the average gift for the MyPay donor was $200 more on average.
The comparison, the only average gift number I have is the 2012 OPM report. So when I'm, if
You're
I...
thinking over
So
average.
I'm saying the average gift that I can compare it to is the 2012 OPM data. So the 2013 average gift in MyPay is compared to that number.
And do you think that's because the donors who use MyPay trust that system and so they're willing to give more, or why would you think it would increase?
Well, number one, the national statistic does have a drag effect in it because it includes cash. And cash is about 20 or 30% of a payroll deduction gift. So there is a delta there. I wish I had a number, and maybe Marcus, we can work on this, a payroll deduction to payroll deduction comparison that would factor that out.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Hi, Deb Perry, Central Ohio and West Virginia campaign. And we have a large military constituency in Columbus. We love MyPay.
Yes.
And you have a DFAS office, too. They'll love to
right
know
next
that.
Door, right next door. We love DFAS. So even in the DLA arena, over 50% of one campaign was MyPay. The hardest part was teaching my commander, Navy Admiral, that it's MyPay and not PayPal. Because he told everybody it's PayPal. So we did a lot of marketing to correct him. And we actually trained to what to input for the workplace. And it's not that federal employees don't know where they work. It's just the fact that with all the acronyms and governmentese, we call our workplaces different things. So that drop-down box is going to help us out a lot.
Okay.
Thanks.
Very quick. We also come from Fort Benning, Georgia. MyPay was a huge success. The issue was with the employers, but a lot of people put in some code, and I didn't know what it was, and I reached out to some of my key persons, and they said, oh, that's a UIC code. And I didn't know whether a UIC code is generic just to a certain installment or post or base, or whether that's DoD-wide. Could that be used?
I have asked, and number one, for you to be able to use the UIC, we'd have to give you a code to know what they are.
Right.
I haven't been able to get a table to tell you what the UIC is. And second, different systems use it differently.
Okay.
So I can't promise you that the UIC is going to be used the same way at Fort Benning to
Anywhere else.
Camp Lejeune to the Pentagon. So it's something we're looking at. So the question we've posed to DFAS and EEX is there already embedded in someone's personnel record something we could map to that information? I don't think there is, and that goes back to the fact that we are interacting through MyPay with those three legacy systems.
Right.
So I've got time for one last.
Thanks.
Oh. Okay. Yes.
Just quick, unless I missed something, I had calls from agencies, my coordinators, when I dealt with them, and I said, some of your people are using MyPay, and they weren't even aware of it, so they didn't even know to include those when they gave me their envelopes of pledge cards. Did I miss telling them how to do that or something?
Well, as we wrapped up the testing and rolled it out, DFAS basically, we turned over the training data in weekly conference calls to PCFOs. I can't speak to a lot of communication that went from DFAS to its client representatives. So the marketing of this is on us. So if we're going to increase the usage, it's up to us to share that training data.
Yeah, I was kind of worrying maybe when they told their coordinator that they pledged, I was hoping they weren't doing a paper pledge card or including them in their envelope total when it was completely separate. So
I really doubt people were doing both, because at the end of the MyPay process, you could save a PDF file and
Yeah.
print that out.
Okay, most of the coordinators didn't even know this was available and people were doing it.
Yeah, it's one of those. I'm sorry. It's one of those things that's really important when it comes down to the training and putting the information out there, to the coordinators and the campaign managers. I can't stress that enough.
And that's, again, it was on that short adoption schedule, so
Yes.
we didn't have it. We'll have it for this fall. John, last but certainly not least.
This isn't so much a question for you, Tony, as much maybe a comment towards Keith and OPM, and that is we'd really like to see OPM expanded to those markets where MyPay or Employee Express were not available in 2013, because we work with a number of military installations where they were not already using Employee Express, and thus MyPay was not available to them in 2013. And so we'd really like to see either both or one, particularly MyPay, expanded to those military installations, particularly like the one that I'm going to use as an example here is Fort Campbell, Kentucky. 30,000 federal military personnel not able to give through MyPay simply because they were not already using. So I'm hoping that OPM can make allowances to allow expand into those military markets that were not already using Employee Express.
We are certainly advocating for that, and there are out of the remaining 70 or so markets, 10 of them represent half of the remaining DFAS personnel. So if we could work those 10 markets, it's going to get the bulk of people who are out there not able to access it right now. But again, that's part of my conference call with the control board next week. And we've gone over by a minute, and Pam is here with the hook. I want to thank my panelists. They got their challenge coin yesterday.